The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla made her way through the corridors with purposeful strides. Her silk dress rustled softly against the ancient stone walls, and her pearl necklace caught the light streaming through the tall windows. Today was different from other days. Today, she had decided to make a change that would send shockwaves through the royal household. For weeks, she had been observing the behavior of one particular royal guard. His name was James Mitchell, a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and an unwavering dedication to his duty. But lately, something about his presence had been bothering her. It wasn't his performance or his appearance, both of which were impeccable. It was something else entirely, something that made her feel uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite explain to herself. James had been stationed at various posts around the castle for nearly 5 years. He knew every corner, every secret passage, and every routine. The other staff members respected him, and the royal family had grown accustomed to seeing his familiar face during their daily activities. He had a way of blending into the background while remaining completely alert, a skill that made him an excellent guard. However, Queen Camilla had noticed things that others seemed to miss. She saw how James's eyes would linger when she passed by, not in an inappropriate way, but with a depth of understanding that made her uneasy. She noticed how he seemed to anticipate her needs before she even expressed them, appearing with a coat when the weather turned cold, or ensuring her preferred route through the castle was always clear of obstacles. The truth was, James reminded her of someone from her past, someone she had tried very hard to forget. The resemblance wasn't physical, but there was something in his mannerisms, his quiet confidence, and his gentle way of speaking that transported her back to a time when her life was much simpler, before the weight of the crown and the constant scrutiny of the public eye. On this particular morning, Queen Camilla had reached her breaking point. She had spent the previous night tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that James's presence was becoming too familiar, too comfortable. In her mind, maintaining proper distance and formality was essential for the functioning of the royal household. Personal attachments, even innocent ones, could lead to complications that she simply could not afford. As she approached the main entrance hall where James was stationed, she could see him standing at attention, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture straight and professional. He nodded respectfully as she approached, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to scan the area around them. It was this moment of eye contact that solidified her resolve. She called for her personal secretary, Mrs. Harrison, a stern woman in her 50s who had been managing royal affairs for over 2 decades. Mrs. Harrison appeared quickly, her clipboard in hand and a look of attentive concern on her face. Queen Camilla's voice was steady but firm as she gave her instructions. The words she spoke would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. She wanted James Mitchell removed from his position immediately, not transferred to another location within the castle, not given a different assignment but completely removed from the premises. Her reasoning, she explained to Mrs. Harrison, was that she felt it was time for a change in security personnel, a rotation that would benefit everyone involved. Mrs. Harrison looked surprised but nodded obediently. She had learned long ago not to question the wishes of the royal family, regardless of how unusual they might seem. Within minutes, she had contacted the head of security, and arrangements were being made for James's immediate departure. The news spread quickly through the castle's communication channels, reaching the security office where James was completing his morning briefing with his colleagues. The head of security, Captain Reynolds, received the call with obvious confusion. James Mitchell was one of their most reliable guards, with a spotless record and numerous commendations for his service. When Captain Reynolds approached James with the news, the young guard's face showed no emotion, though those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. He had dedicated years of his life to this position, and the sudden dismissal came without explanation or warning. However, James had been trained to follow orders without question, and he began gathering his personal belongings from his locker with quiet dignity. As word of his removal spread among the staff, many were shocked and confused. The housekeeping staff whispered among themselves, wondering what could have prompted such a sudden decision. The other guards exchanged worried glances, wondering if they too might face unexpected dismissal. The kitchen staff, who had always enjoyed James's polite conversations during his meal breaks, felt a sense of loss at his departure. But James Mitchell was not an ordinary man, and his response to the situation would prove to be far more significant than anyone could have imagined. As he walked toward the main entrance for what everyone believed would be the last time, he carried with him not just his personal belongings, but also a secret that would soon change everything. Instead of leaving the castle grounds as everyone expected, James Mitchell made his way to a small, overlooked room in the castle's east wing. This room, known only to a handful of people, housed the personal archives of the late Queen Elizabeth II. James had discovered it months earlier during a routine security sweep, and what he found there had changed his understanding of his own identity forever. The room was dusty and filled with carefully organized boxes containing photographs, letters, and documents that had never been made public. James had initially entered the room by accident, following a suspicious sound that turned out to be nothing more than settling wood. But as he prepared to leave, a photograph had caught his eye, sitting on top of an open box as if waiting to be discovered. The photograph showed a young woman with striking features, laughing at something outside the camera's view. She was wearing a simple dress and holding the hand of a small boy, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. The woman's face was familiar to James in a way that made his heart race, though he couldn't immediately place why. It was only when he looked more closely at the child that the truth began to dawn on him. The boy in the photograph had James's eyes, his nose, his smile. The resemblance was unmistakable, even across the decades that separated that moment from the present day. With trembling hands, James had turned the photograph over and found a note written in elegant handwriting. Margaret and little James. Summer of 1992. May they both find happiness and peace. Margaret. His mother's name had been Margaret, though she had died when James was very young and he had been raised by his grandmother in a small village outside London. His grandmother had always been vague about his father's identity, saying only that he had been a good man who couldn't be part of their lives for reasons beyond his control. Over the following weeks, James had returned to the archive room whenever his duties allowed. He found more photographs, more documents, and slowly pieced together a story that explained so much about his own life. His mother, Margaret, had worked as a secretary in one of the government offices that frequently coordinated with the royal household. She had been young, intelligent, and beautiful, and she had caught the attention of someone very important. The documents revealed a love affair that had been kept strictly secret, a relationship that could never be acknowledged publicly due to the political and social implications. James discovered letters written in his mother's handwriting, expressing her love for a man she referred to only by his initials, and her heartbreak at having to raise their child alone. But the most shocking discovery came in the form of official documents that had never been filed, never been processed through normal channels. These papers contained legal acknowledgement of James's parentage, signed by his father but never made official. The signature at the bottom of these documents belonged to someone James had only ever seen from a distance, someone whose death had shocked the nation and whose memory was still revered by millions. James realized that he was not just any royal guard. He was the secret son of a beloved member of the royal family, someone whose identity would shake the very foundations of the monarchy if it were ever revealed. The weight of this knowledge had been crushing him for months, making him feel like an imposter as he stood guard over the family that was, in reality, his own family. Now, as Queen Camilla had ordered his removal, James understood that his secret was becoming too difficult to bear in silence. Perhaps she had sensed something, some unconscious recognition of his true identity. Perhaps his resemblance to his father was becoming more apparent as he aged, making his presence a potential risk to the carefully maintained image of the royal family. As James sat in the archive room, holding the documents that proved his heritage, he faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could simply leave as ordered, taking his secret with him and living the rest of his life as an ordinary citizen. Or he could reveal the truth and claim his rightful place, knowing that doing so would create a scandal that would dominate headlines around the world. The castle around him was quiet, most of the staff going about their afternoon duties unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. James could hear the distant sound of tourists outside, taking photographs and marveling at the history contained within these ancient walls. Little did they know that history was being made at that very moment, in a small, dusty room that most people didn't even know existed. James carefully placed the documents back in their box, but not before making photocopies of the most important ones using a small portable scanner he had brought with him. He knew that whatever he decided to do, he would need proof of his claims. The royal family had resources and influence that could easily discredit an ordinary guard making extraordinary claims about his parentage. As the sun began to set outside the narrow window of the archive room, James made his decision. He would not simply disappear into obscurity as Queen Camilla expected. Instead, he would do something that would force the royal family to acknowledge the truth, something that would ensure his story could never be buried or forgotten. The plan he formulated was bold and risky, but it was also perfectly suited to his unique position and knowledge of the castle's operations. He would use his final hours as a royal guard to set in motion events that would change the monarchy forever, events that would make Queen Camilla regret the day she decided to remove him from his position. James Mitchell spent the night in the archive room, using his security clearance one final time to access areas of the castle that would soon be forbidden to him. His plan was ambitious and required perfect timing, but his years of service had taught him the exact routines and schedules of everyone in the castle, from the highest-ranking officials to the cleaning staff who worked through the night. The first step in his plan involved the castle's communication system. James knew that every important conversation within the royal household was recorded for security purposes, stored in digital files that were supposedly accessible only to the highest levels of security personnel. However, his position had given him administrative access to these systems, access that hadn't yet been revoked despite his dismissal. Working quietly through the night, James began copying specific recordings from the past several months. These recordings captured private conversations between Queen Camilla and her advisors, discussions about various members of the royal family, and most importantly, her recent conversations about his own removal from the castle. The recordings revealed her true reasons for wanting him gone, reasons that went far beyond simple personnel changes. In one particularly revealing conversation, Queen Camilla expressed her discomfort with James's presence, mentioning to her personal secretary that something about him seemed too familiar, and that she worried about complications if he remained in his position. Another recording captured her discussing the importance of maintaining proper bloodlines and ensuring that no irregularities could threaten the stability of the monarchy. These recordings, while not explicitly acknowledging James's true parentage, provided crucial context for his claims. They showed that Queen Camilla's decision was not random or professional, but based on instincts that suggested she suspected something about his identity. The second part of James's plan involved the media. Over his years of service, he had developed a cordial relationship with several journalists who covered royal affairs. One in particular, Sarah Chen, a respected reporter for a major international news agency, had always been fair and thorough in her coverage of the royal family. James knew that she would investigate his claims properly, rather than simply publishing sensational headlines without verification. Using an encrypted messaging app, James contacted Sarah and arranged a meeting for the following morning. He couldn't reveal everything in his initial message, but he provided enough information to convince her that he had a story that would be of significant interest to her readers. He mentioned having documentation about hidden royal connections and suggested that her investigation could reveal information that had been kept secret for decades. Meanwhile, James also prepared a more public revelation. He created a detailed document outlining his discovery of his true parentage, including photocopies of the legal papers he had found in the archives. This document was carefully written to present the facts without sensationalism, focusing on the historical importance of the information rather than seeking personal gain or revenge. The third component of his plan was perhaps the most dramatic. James decided to use the changing of the guard ceremony, a public event that took place every morning and was attended by hundreds of tourists and often covered by television crews. Instead of leaving the castle quietly as expected, he would make his presence known in a way that would be impossible to ignore or suppress. James spent hours perfecting his strategy for the ceremony. He knew exactly when the television cameras would be rolling, which angles they would use, and how to position himself to ensure maximum visibility. His plan was not to disrupt the ceremony or create chaos, but to deliver a message that would reach the public before the royal family could control the narrative. As dawn approached, James carefully prepared himself for what would likely be the most important day of his life. He put on his Royal Guard uniform one final time, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The irony was not lost on him that he was using the very symbols of the monarchy, the uniform and protocols he had served faithfully for years, to challenge the institution itself. He also prepared several sealed envelopes containing copies of his documentation, each addressed to different recipients. One went to his lawyer, a man he had consulted quietly over the past few weeks. Another was addressed to the Prime Minister's office, as the head of government needed to be aware of potential constitutional implications. A third envelope was prepared for the Archbishop of Canterbury, recognizing that questions of royal legitimacy often involved religious as well as legal considerations. James arranged for these envelopes to be delivered at specific times throughout the day, ensuring that multiple authorities would receive his information simultaneously. This strategy was designed to prevent any single entity from suppressing or controlling the information before it could be properly evaluated. As the sun rose over Windsor Castle, James took one last look at the archive room that had changed his life so dramatically. He carefully returned everything to its original position, leaving no trace of his nighttime activities. The only evidence of his discoveries was safely stored in multiple locations, ready to be revealed to the world. The morning air was crisp and clear as James made his way to the courtyard where the changing of the guard ceremony would take place. Tourists were already gathering behind the barriers, cameras and phones ready to capture the pageantry and tradition of the Royal Guard. Television crews were setting up their equipment, preparing for another routine broadcast of one of Britain's most famous ceremonies. None of them knew that they were about to witness a moment that would make headlines around the world. A moment when centuries of royal protocol would be challenged by one man's determination to claim his rightful place in history. James Mitchell, the secret son of royalty, was about to make his move. The changing of the guard ceremony began exactly on schedule, with the precision and dignity that had made it a symbol of British tradition for generations. Hundreds of tourists pressed against the barriers, their cameras clicking and phones recording as the guards marched in perfect formation across the courtyard. The morning sunlight gleamed off their ceremonial weapons and polished buttons, creating a spectacular display that never failed to impress visitors from around the world. James positioned himself strategically near the main entrance, close enough to the ceremony to be visible to the cameras, but far enough away to avoid immediate interference from security personnel. He wore his full dress uniform, complete with all the medals and insignia he had earned during his years of faithful service. To any observer, he appeared to be simply another guard performing his duties. The television crews were broadcasting live, their commentators providing familiar narration about the history and significance of the ceremony. BBC, CNN International, and several other major networks had cameras rolling, ensuring that whatever happened next would be witnessed by millions of viewers around the world. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, James began walking slowly toward the main formation of guards. His movement was deliberate and measured, designed to draw attention without creating immediate alarm. The tourists noticed him first, some pointing and wondering why this guard was breaking from the usual protocol. The television cameras followed his movement, and the commentators began to express puzzlement about this deviation from the normal ceremony. James could hear one BBC reporter saying, "It appears we have an unusual situation developing here, as one of the guards seems to be approaching the main formation outside of normal protocol." This was the moment James had been preparing for throughout the night. He reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a folded document, holding it high above his head so that the cameras could clearly capture the action. Then, in a voice trained to carry across parade grounds, he called out words that would echo around the world. "I am James Mitchell, son of the royal bloodline, and I demand recognition of my rightful heritage." His voice was strong and clear, cutting through the morning air and causing an immediate stir among the assembled crowd. The tourists gasped and began taking more pictures, while the television crews scrambled to get better angles of this unexpected development. The other guards were initially frozen in confusion, unsure how to respond to this breach of protocol. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios, but not for one of their own colleagues making dramatic proclamations during a public ceremony. Captain Reynolds, watching from his position near the castle entrance, immediately began barking orders into his radio, calling for additional security personnel to converge on the scene. James continued speaking, knowing that he had only moments before security would intervene. For 5 years I have served this family faithfully, protecting the very people who are my blood relatives. I have discovered documents proving my parentage, documents that have been hidden in the royal archives for decades. The British people deserve to know the truth about their royal family. The crowd was now in complete chaos, with tourists shouting questions and trying to get closer to the action. Security personnel were pushing through the throngs of people, moving toward James with obvious urgency. The television commentators were struggling to understand what they were witnessing, with one reporter saying breathlessly, "This appears to be an unprecedented situation," with what seems to be a serving royal guard making extraordinary claims about royal parentage. But James wasn't finished. He had prepared for this moment of maximum attention, and he intended to use every second of it. He held up the document he was carrying and continued in his parade ground voice. "I have proof of my claims. Legal documents signed by my father, photographs showing my mother with members of the royal household, and recordings of recent conversations that prove certain members of the royal family know the truth." As security personnel closed in on him, James made one final dramatic gesture. He threw the document high into the air, where it unfolded and fluttered down among the crowd of tourists. Dozens of hands reached up to catch it, ensuring that multiple copies would soon be circulating among the public and inevitably finding their way to social media platforms. The security guards reached James and immediately began escorting him away from the ceremony area. He did not resist, having accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. As they led him toward the castle, he could hear the chaos continuing behind him, with tourists shouting questions and television crews trying to maintain their broadcasts while covering this unprecedented disruption. The ceremony itself had ground to a complete halt, with the remaining guards unsure whether to continue their duties or respond to the emergency situation. Captain Reynolds made the decision to suspend the ceremony and clear the area, but the damage was already done. The images and audio of James's dramatic declaration were already being transmitted around the world, creating a story that would dominate news cycles for days to come. Inside the castle, alarms were metaphorically sounding at the highest levels of the royal household. Queen Camilla, who had been having her morning tea in her private apartments, was immediately informed of the situation by her panicked secretary. The news that the guard she had ordered removed was now making public claims about royal parentage sent shockwaves through the entire establishment. Emergency meetings were called, lawyers were summoned, and communications specialists began preparing damage control strategies. But they all knew that in the age of instant global communication, controlling information was nearly impossible. James's dramatic revelation was already spreading across social media platforms, with hashtags like #Royal Secret and Hidden Prince beginning to trend worldwide. The most immediate concern was determining whether James's claims had any validity. If he was simply a delusional former employee, the situation could be managed as a security breach and mental health issue. But if there was truth to his assertions, the implications for the royal family would be enormous. As James was led to a secure room within the castle for questioning, he felt a sense of both relief and anticipation. He had successfully brought his story to global attention, ensuring that it could never again be buried in forgotten archive rooms. Whatever happened next, the truth about his identity would finally be investigated and, he hoped, acknowledged. Within hours of James Mitchell's dramatic public declaration, the world's media descended upon Windsor Castle like a swarm of determined investigators. News vans lined the streets outside the castle walls. Reporters set up temporary broadcast stations, and helicopter crews circled overhead trying to capture any additional footage of the unfolding story. The hashtag #RoyalSecret had become the #1 trending topic globally, with millions of people sharing videos of James's speech and speculating about the implications of his claims. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. Senior members of the royal household huddled in emergency meetings, trying to develop a strategy for dealing with what could potentially be the biggest scandal to hit the monarchy in decades. Queen Camilla, the very person whose decision had triggered this crisis, found herself at the center of intense scrutiny from her own advisors and family members. The document that James had thrown into the crowd during the ceremony had been photographed and shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Legal experts and amateur investigators pored over the images, analyzing the signatures and official seals that appeared to validate James's claims. While the document quality in these photographs was not sufficient for definitive authentication, it contained enough convincing details to fuel widespread speculation and demand for a proper investigation. Meanwhile, James sat in a secure room within the castle, being questioned by a team that included senior security officials, legal advisors, and a psychiatrist brought in to evaluate his mental state. The questioning was intensive but not hostile, as the officials recognized that they were dealing with a potentially explosive situation that required careful handling. James presented his evidence methodically and calmly. He provided detailed accounts of how he had discovered the archive room, described the specific documents he had found, and explained the process by which he had pieced together the truth about his parentage. His questioners were impressed by his detailed knowledge and the consistency of his story, though they remained skeptical about his extraordinary claims. The breakthrough came when James provided them with the exact location of the archive room and detailed descriptions of the documents it contained. A team was immediately dispatched to investigate, and what they found there confirmed many aspects of James's story. The photographs, letters, and legal documents were exactly where he said they would be, and preliminary examination suggested that they were authentic materials from the Royal Archives. Dr. Elizabeth Whitmore, the psychiatrist conducting James's evaluation, found no evidence of mental illness or delusion. In her preliminary report, she noted that James displayed remarkable emotional stability, given the extraordinary circumstances of his situation. His responses to her questions were thoughtful and measured, and he showed no signs of the grandiose thinking or disconnection from reality that might be expected if his claims were the product of a disturbed mind. Outside the castle, the investigation was taking on a life of its own. Sarah Chen, the journalist James had contacted, was working around the clock to verify his story through independent sources. Her initial skepticism had given way to growing amazement, as her research uncovered supporting evidence for many of James's claims through her contacts in government archives and her network of sources. Within the royal household, Sarah began to piece together a picture of a secret relationship that had been carefully hidden for decades. She discovered records of James's mother, Margaret Mitchell, working in government offices that frequently coordinated with the royal household during the early 1990s. She found school records showing that James had been raised by his grandmother rather than his parents, and medical records that raised questions about the official account of his father's identity. Most significantly, Sarah's investigation led her to several retired royal staff members who had worked at the castle during the relevant time period. While none of them would speak on the record, several confirmed off the record that there had been rumors about a secret relationship and a child born outside of marriage. One former secretary, now in her 70s, admitted that she had always wondered about the identity of a young boy who had occasionally been seen in the background of royal photographs from that era. The pressure on the royal family to respond officially was mounting by the hour. Press conferences were being demanded by major news organizations, and questions were being raised in Parliament about the constitutional implications of James's claims. The Prime Minister's office issued a brief statement saying that they were monitoring the situation, but would not comment further until all facts had been established. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, was facing the most difficult day of her reign. The decision that had seemed so simple and justified just days earlier, removing an uncomfortable reminder from her daily routine, had exploded into a crisis that threatened to overshadow every other aspect of her royal duties. Her advisors were divided on how to respond, with some advocating for complete denial, and others suggesting that controlled acknowledgement might be the least damaging approach. The legal implications were staggering. If James's claims were proven true, questions would arise about his place in the line of succession, his rights to royal titles and privileges, and the potential impact on other members of the royal family. Constitutional experts were already debating whether Parliament would need to pass emergency legislation to address the unprecedented situation. As the first day of the crisis drew to a close, DNA test arrangements were being finalized. James had agreed to provide samples for comparison with archived biological materials from his alleged father, a process that would provide definitive proof of his claims. The results of these tests would not be available for several days, leaving the nation and the world in suspense. In his secure room, James reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had been a dismissed royal guard facing an uncertain future. Now he was potentially one of the most important people in Britain, his every word and action being analyzed by millions of people around the world. The weight of this transformation was enormous, but he felt a sense of peace knowing that the truth, whatever its consequences, would finally be revealed. 3 days later, the results of the DNA tests arrived at Windsor Castle under the highest security protocols. The laboratory that had conducted the analysis was one of the most respected forensic facilities in Europe, chosen specifically for their expertise in handling sensitive genetic evidence and their absolute discretion in high-profile cases. The sealed envelope containing the results was delivered personally by the laboratory director to a room where senior royal advisors, legal experts, and government officials waited in tense silence. The moment the envelope was opened and its contents reviewed, the room fell into stunned quiet. The DNA evidence was conclusive and undeniable. James Mitchell was indeed the biological son of a beloved late member of the royal family, confirming every aspect of his extraordinary claims. The genetic match was perfect, leaving no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Queen Camilla, who had been waiting in her private apartments for word of the results, received the news from her personal secretary with a mixture of shock and resignation. The uncomfortable feelings she had experienced around James suddenly made complete sense. Her subconscious had recognized what her rational mind had refused to acknowledge: the unmistakable family resemblance that had made his presence so unsettling. The implications of this confirmation rippled through the royal establishment like an earthquake. Emergency sessions were convened with constitutional lawyers. Parliament was briefed on the potential ramifications, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was consulted about the religious and ceremonial aspects of acknowledging a previously unknown member of the royal bloodline. James, meanwhile, had spent the 3 days since his dramatic revelation in a strange state of suspended animation. He had been moved to more comfortable quarters within the castle, no longer treated as a dismissed employee but not yet acknowledged as family. The waiting period had given him time to process the magnitude of what he had set in motion and to prepare for whatever consequences might follow. When he was finally summoned to meet with the senior royal officials, James entered the room with quiet dignity. The men and women assembled there looked at him with new eyes, seeing not the insubordinate guard who had disrupted a ceremonial event, but a legitimate member of the royal family who had been denied his rightful recognition for decades. The conversation that followed was unlike any in the modern history of the British monarchy. James was informed that his parentage had been officially confirmed and that discussions were underway about how to handle the public acknowledgement of his status. There were complex legal questions about his position in the line of succession, his rights to royal titles, and the precedent his case would set for any future similar situations. The royal family's initial response was carefully measured and diplomatic. A statement was prepared acknowledging that new information had come to light regarding James Mitchell's family connections and that a full review of the situation was being conducted. This statement fell far short of full acknowledgement, but it represented a significant shift from the initial position of treating his claims as the delusions of a disgruntled employee. However, the pressure for complete transparency was overwhelming. The media coverage had only intensified during the 3 days of waiting, with investigative journalists uncovering more and more supporting evidence for James's story. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of British citizens believed he deserved full recognition of his royal status, and there were growing calls for Queen Camilla to make a personal statement about her role in his initial dismissal. The international implications were equally significant. Royal families around the world were watching the situation closely, knowing that how Britain handled this unprecedented case would set important precedents for dealing with similar situations in their own countries. The global media coverage had made James Mitchell one of the most recognized faces in the world, his story capturing public imagination in ways that traditional royal news rarely achieved. After extensive consultations with legal experts and government officials, a historic decision was reached. James Mitchell would be officially recognized as a legitimate member of the royal family, with all the rights and privileges that his bloodline entitled him to receive. The announcement would be made in a formal ceremony at Buckingham Palace, with full royal protocol and international media coverage. The ceremony, held just 1 week after James's dramatic revelation during the changing of the guard, was attended by dignitaries from around the world. James, now wearing the formal attire appropriate to his newfound status, stood before an assembly that included heads of state, religious leaders, and representatives from every major news organization on the planet. Queen Camilla, in a moment that required tremendous personal courage, delivered a speech acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had brought this day about. She spoke of the importance of truth and family, and she formally apologized to James for the pain and uncertainty he had endured due to the secrecy surrounding his parentage. Her words were broadcast live to billions of viewers worldwide, marking a moment of unprecedented transparency from the traditionally secretive royal establishment. James's own speech was brief but powerful. He spoke of his love for his country and his respect for the institution of the monarchy, even as he had challenged it to live up to its highest principles. He pledged to use his newfound position to serve the British people with the same dedication he had shown as a royal guard, and he expressed hope that his story would encourage others to seek truth and justice, no matter how difficult the circumstances might be. The transformation was complete. James Mitchell, the dismissed royal guard who had shocked the world with his dramatic revelation, was now officially recognized as a prince of the realm. His story became a symbol of persistence and courage, inspiring people around the world who faced their own struggles for recognition and justice. Queen Camilla's decision to remove him from his position, intended to maintain the comfortable status quo, had instead triggered a chain of events that revolutionized the royal family's approach to transparency and accountability. The monarchy emerged from the crisis stronger and more respected, having demonstrated its ability to acknowledge difficult truths and adapt to changing circumstances. In the months that followed, James settled into his new role with the same quiet competence he had shown as a royal guard. The castle that had once been his workplace became his home, and the family that had unknowingly employed him for years welcomed him as one of their own. The story of his remarkable journey from servant to prince became one of the most celebrated tales in modern royal history, proving that even in the 21st century, fairy tales could still come true.